BBC building in central London, tens of thousands of protesters set off on a march to Parliament Square. The group included politicians, union leaders and the comedian Russell Brand, and they were demonstrating against the impact of cuts being imposed under the government's so-called austerity programme. But if you didn't see or hear about it on BBC News, you weren't alone. Thousands of people have complained to the BBC since then that it didn't give the demonstration the attention it deserved. Among them was Gail Mason, who emailed us asking, "How can the BBC justify ignoring thousands of people marching through London? The words censorship and bias spring to mind." Martin Wanless pointed out that this is not the first time the BBC hasn't reported on demonstrations against the current government. There was the protest march outside the Tory conference. Does the BBC have some sort of political bias against the people who disagree with this government? And Jan Dodds wrote, 15 seconds worth of coverage on the BBC News channel is hardly mainstream and is just paying lip service to the ideal of serving the public interest and ensuring impartiality. The BBC expended more time and effort reporting on and discovering the identity of the Scottish fan shown cheering for Uruguay. Shame upon you. Well, we asked the BBC to come on and discuss this on Newswatch, but they declined, sending us a statement, which I'll read in a moment. In the meantime, one of those who was marching on the streets of London last Saturday and who encouraged others on Twitter to express their dissatisfaction with the BBC's coverage of the demonstration is the journalist Owen Jones, and he joins me now. Owen, what's your concern?
Well, firstly, I think it's cowardly on the part of the BBC not to turn up to respond to these concerns in person, but I just want to show you here, it's a report from 2011 on the BBC, and it's a report about a pro-cuts demonstration organised by Rally Against Debt, so they support cuts. This demonstration, do you know how many people were on it? Not 10,000, not 5,000, not even 1,000. 350 people turned up, and yet this demonstration merited extensive coverage on the BBC. 50,000 people demonstrated last week, and there was no coverage whatsoever, except when the BBC were bombarded with so many complaints. They posted a half-hearted link which had a video lasting 20 seconds with no commentary on it whatsoever. Millions of people support the aims of this demonstration. Most people in this country, they want renationalisation of rail, according to the polls, of energy, they want higher taxes on the rich. They think the cuts are unfair in how they're done, and about a quarter of the population oppose all cuts whatsoever. There'll be people watching this who think, I don't agree with that view whatsoever, but I think they would agree that if that is such a large vein of public opinion, if people are marching on the streets at a time where the government isn't being properly challenged about the narrative, however much people agree or disagree with that narrative, then there should be some coverage of it, especially when coverage is given to a demonstration of 350 people supporting this demonstration.
Right, well, the BBC hasn't come on, but they have sent this statement. So let me read it to you and then let's talk about it. We covered this demonstration on the BBC News channel with 5 reports throughout Saturday evening on the BBC News website on Sunday, as well as on social media. We choose which stories we cover based on how newsworthy they are and what else is happening, and we didn't provide extensive coverage because of a number of bigger national and international news stories that day. We reflect the concerns of people such as those demonstrating and others who hold opposing views across our daily news output. We are satisfied that overall our coverage is fair and impartial.
There was a BBC report that day about the length of grass on the Wimbledon court. Look, this is not the days of the 1980s when you have the 6 o'clock and the 10 o'clock news. There is a massive BBC website. There is rolling news coverage on the news channel, and yet there was no coverage. Regardless of what they say,
they obviously ran some pictures and they talked.
They posted a 20-second video which informed people there was no commentary in this video, which just showed a few people marching around. That only came after, over 6,000 people have complained to the BBC. I doubt there's been that many complaints about any other issue for a very, very long time indeed, and that shows that.
There's a couple of issues. People like you obviously feel very passionately about this, but it is also a politically divisive issue, and it's significant that most other organisations, news organisations, didn't cover it with kind of big reports. There's also an issue about the numbers who came and the timing. If this march had been pegged to something like an imminent parliamentary vote, perhaps there might have been the judgment that it was more of a newsworthy event.
Austerity is a constant news story. It's never ending. And I think at the moment, not least with the government's narrative that they're turning the economy around, even as living standards are falling and so on, opportunity to show, well, actually, there are people in Britain who disagree with that narrative and don't think the Labour leadership, for example, are doing all they can. I think that is a very substantial news story. And I think there's a broader problem about this, and this is why the march started at the BBC. This is even more ludicrous. Couldn't even send a journalist outside to cover a demonstration starting from the BBC because of the lack of coverage of these issues.
You think the BBC is deliberately choosing to ignore these kinds of demonstrations?
Absolutely. And the research shows this. It's not just me spouting this off. The research by Cardiff University found, for example, that on the 6 o'clock news, there is 19 times more interviews of business sources than trade union sources, and trade unionists obviously were key on this march.
Is this a bigger issue about the attitude of trade unions?
Clearly. I mean, look, trade unions are the biggest democratic movement in the country still. I mean, over 6 million workers belong to trade unions, and yet there's 19 times more coverage of business representatives than trade unions. And this is a demonstration organised by trade unions, who the BBC very rarely show. And I have to say, if someone had kicked off on that demonstration, and if a window had been smashed, then there would have been cameras. People obviously should have the right to protest, but even if you disagree with those protesters, they should be able to air their views and have a public broadcaster like the BBC give a platform, scrutinise them, challenge them, criticise their arguments and put counter-arguments to them, but to not show any coverage whatsoever of tens of thousands of people on an anti-government demonstration marching through London, that's not defensible, and that's why 6,000 people have complained.
Owen Jones, thanks very much.